Yorkshire, England, April 1818. The morning light filtered through the ancient stained glass windows of St. George, Hanover Square, casting jewelled patterns across the cold marble floor where Georgiana Isabel Wycliffe stood in borrowed white silk, her hands quaking at the wrist. She could barely hold the small bouquet of forced hothouse roses. At 19, she had imagined her wedding day 1,000 different ways during the years her mother had prepared her to be the perfect wife, teaching her watercolors and French and the precise angle at which to pour tea. Not once had she imagined this. The Marquess of Ravensmere stood beside her, tall and imposing in his immaculate morning coat, his profile carved from granite as the vicar droned through vows that felt like a death sentence. Richard Blackwell was 42 years old, more than twice her age, and though society whispered he had been handsome in his youth, grief had carved deep lines around his mouth and eyes that made him appear older still. His hand, when it took hers to slide the heavy gold band onto her finger, was warm and steady, while hers felt like ice. Behind them, the church held perhaps 36 witnesses, mostly her uncle's associates and a smattering of curious society matrons who had come to observe what everyone knew was little more than a financial arrangement. "Poor child," she heard Lady Castleton whisper behind her fan, "sacrificed to winter itself." The words carried in the vast silence of the ancient church, finding their mark in Georgiana's shattered spirit. If you believe in stories where the coldest arrangements can kindle the warmest love, subscribe now and stay with us. You will not want to miss what happens when two wounded souls discover that freedom and love are not opposites, but the same truth spoken in different languages. The wedding breakfast at Ravensmere House in Grosvenor Square proceeded as a subdued affair, the townhouse Richard maintained for his infrequent visits to London. Georgiana sat at the head of a table, laden with delicacies she could not taste, accepting congratulations from people whose pity she could feel like a physical weight. Her uncle, the new Earl of Wycliffe, looked positively jovial as he accepted a glass of champagne from a footman. The burden of his niece finally lifted from his shoulders, along with the crushing debts her father had left behind. Richard spoke little during the breakfast, his responses to well-wishers courteous but brief. When their eyes met across the table, Georgiana found his gaze unreadable, neither warm nor cold, simply distant, as though he were looking at a painting rather than the young woman he had just married. She looked away first, focusing on the untouched salmon on her plate, wondering if this was to be the pattern of her life now. Proximity without connection, marriage without intimacy, existence without joy. The journey to Yorkshire began that afternoon in Richard's travelling carriage, a well-sprung vehicle upholstered in deep green velvet that smelt of leather and some masculine scent she could not identify. They sat opposite each other as the miles rolled past, the silence between them broken only by the rhythmic sound of hooves on the road and the occasional creak of the carriage springs. Georgiana kept her gaze fixed on the passing countryside, watching as London's smoke and noise gave way to rolling hills and stone walls, each mile carrying her further from everything she had known. "You should rest," Richard said finally, his voice startling her after hours of quiet. "We will not reach Ravensmere Abbey until well after dark. There is a blanket in the compartment beside you if you are cold." "Thank you, my lord," Georgiana replied softly, the formal address feeling strange on her tongue. She was his wife now, yet she could not imagine calling him by his Christian name. Not when he felt like a stranger, not when the space between them seemed as vast as the Yorkshire moors they were travelling toward. He nodded once and returned his attention to the ledger he had been reviewing, his expression absorbed in columns of numbers that meant nothing to Georgiana. She watched him covertly from beneath her lashes, noting the silver threads at his temples, the strong line of his jaw, the resolute hands that held his pen with the same steady control he seemed to apply to everything. He was not unkind, she thought, simply absent, even while sitting 3 feet away from her. Darkness had indeed fallen by the time the carriage turned onto a long, tree-lined drive, the ancient oaks forming a tunnel overhead that blocked even the faint starlight. When Ravensmere Abbey finally came into view, Georgiana caught her breath despite herself. The house rose from the Yorkshire landscape like something from a Gothic novel, all towers and mullioned windows, built of grey stone that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. Ivy climbed the western wall, and light glowed warmly from several windows, promising sanctuary after the long journey. A housekeeper awaited them in the great entrance hall, a tall, spare woman in her 50s with kind eyes and capable hands. "My lord, my lady," she said, curtsying deeply. "Welcome home. I am Mrs. Hartley. We have prepared the family chambers as you requested." Richard helped Georgiana from her travelling cloak with impersonal courtesy before addressing the housekeeper. "Lady Ravensmere will require a hot bath and supper sent to her rooms. The journey has been taxing." "Of course, my lord. I will see to it immediately." Georgiana followed Mrs. Hartley up a grand staircase, her kid boots silent on the thick carpet runner, her eyes taking in portraits of stern-faced ancestors and elaborate plasterwork that spoke of centuries of family history. The Marchioness's chambers encompassed a suite of 3 rooms, a bedchamber decorated in shades of cream and gold, a dressing room, and a small sitting room with a view she could not see in the darkness, but suspected would be lovely by daylight. "The Marquess's chambers are through that door, my lady," Mrs. Hartley said, indicating a connecting door Georgiana had not initially noticed. "But he wished me to assure you that it remains locked from your side. You need not fear any intrusion." The words, clearly delivered with the best of intentions, somehow made Georgiana feel more alone than ever. She thanked the housekeeper softly and waited until the woman had withdrawn before sinking onto the edge of the enormous 4-poster bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop their trembling. This was her wedding night, the culmination of a young woman's dreams, and she sat alone in a strange room in a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home, married to a man who had already made it clear he expected nothing from her but her presence. The bath arrived, carried by 2 maids who filled a copper tub before the fire and left her with murmured wishes for a good evening. Georgiana bathed mechanically, the hot water easing some of the ache from her shoulders, but doing nothing for the cold weight in her chest. She had just finished dressing in the nightgown and wrapper Mrs. Hartley had laid out, when she noticed something on the dressing table that had not been there before. A small box of midnight blue velvet sat beside her brush, and next to it, a folded letter sealed with the Ravensmere crest. Her hands shook as she broke the seal and unfolded the heavy paper, recognizing Richard's bold handwriting from the marriage settlement documents she had been required to sign. The words she read would change everything, though she did not yet understand how. "My lady," the letter began, formal even in this most intimate of moments. "Within this box you will find a key of silver. It unlocks the door between our chambers, a door that shall remain secured unless and until you choose to open it. I do not offer this choice because I find you lacking in any way. You are blameless in the circumstances that have brought us to this arrangement. I offer it because no person should be compelled to any intimacy they have not freely chosen, regardless of law or contract or societal expectation. You may open that door tonight, tomorrow, next month, next year, or never. The choice shall always be yours, and I shall respect whatever you decide without question or complaint. No one should be forced. I trust this finds you well after our journey. Sleep soundly and know that you are safe here. Richard Blackwell, Marquess of Ravensmere." Georgiana read the letter 3 times, her mind struggling to comprehend what he was offering. With trembling fingers, she opened the velvet box to find a small silver key, intricately worked and gleaming in the firelight. She lifted it, feeling its weight in her palm, and looked toward the connecting door. Beyond it lay her husband, a man she did not know, who had just given her something she had not known to ask for: freedom. She set the key carefully on her bedside table, placed the letter beside it, and extinguished her candle. As she lay in the darkness of her wedding night, alone in a bed built for 2, Georgiana Wycliffe felt something she had not experienced since the morning her uncle had informed her of her impending marriage: the faintest stirring of hope. The weeks that followed established a pattern that was both comfortable and strange. Richard proved to be a man of rigid routines, and Georgiana soon learned to navigate around them like a ship charting familiar waters. He rose before dawn for a long ride across his estate, returning muddy and windblown to breakfast alone in his study, while reviewing reports from his steward. Richard had also been diverting substantial estate funds to secure several tenant properties damaged by a recent unforeseen storm. She took her own breakfast in the small morning room overlooking the rose garden, accompanied only by the household cat, an ancient tabby named Perseus, who had made her acquaintance with singular indifference. Their only regular interaction occurred at 4 o'clock each afternoon, when they met for tea in the conservatory. Richard appeared precisely on time each day, his cravat freshly tied, his manner courteous and distant. They discussed neutral topics, the weather, improvements to the estate, news from London that arrived via post. He asked polite questions about her comfort and her needs. She provided equally polite responses, neither mentioned the key that remained on her bedside table, untouched. The tenants near the eastern border have requested permission to repair the stone wall separating their properties, Richard said one afternoon in late May, adding sugar to his tea with precise movements. I have approved the expense. The wall has stood for 2 centuries. It would be foolish to let it fall to ruin now. That seems very reasonable, my lord, Georgiana replied, pouring herself a second cup even though she was not particularly thirsty. The ritual of tea service gave her hands something to do, a purpose in these strange, formal encounters. Do you often involve yourself in such details of the estate management? I find it necessary. My father left many matters to his steward and lived to regret the neglect. I prefer to understand precisely what occurs on lands that have been in my family's trust for 400 years. She studied him over the rim of her teacup, noting the way afternoon light from the conservatory windows caught in his dark hair, turning the silver threads to platinum. He was handsome, she realized with some surprise, in a severe, weathered way that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with the strength of his features. His hands, wrapped around the delicate porcelain cup, were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who worked alongside his tenants rather than simply collecting their rents from a distance. You disapprove of absentee landlords, she observed quietly. His gaze lifted to meet hers, and for a moment something flickered in those grey eyes, some emotion she could not quite name, before it vanished behind his usual reserve. I disapprove of men who accept the privileges of their position while shirking its responsibilities. The tenants depend upon me for their livelihoods. I owe them competent stewardship at the very least. It was the longest speech he had made to her in the month since their marriage, and Georgiana found herself leaning forward slightly, hungry for any glimpse of the man behind the formal courtesy. My father believed similarly, she said softly. Before the gambling consumed him, he used to say that a title was a burden as much as an honor. He was correct in that assessment, if little else. The words were harsh, but his tone was not unkind, merely factual. Georgiana set down her cup carefully, her throat tight. I am sorry for the debts he left behind. I know they were substantial. They were not your doing, Richard replied, his voice returning to its usual even tenor. You bear no responsibility for his failures. He stood, brushing imaginary lint from his coat, signaling the end of their daily ritual. If you will excuse me, I have correspondence to attend to before dinner. And just like that, he was gone, leaving Georgiana alone among the orchids and ferns, with only Perseus for company. The cat wound around her ankles, purring, and she reached down to scratch behind his ears, blinking back tears she did not fully understand. Why did it hurt to be treated with such scrupulous courtesy? Why did freedom feel so much like loneliness? But if her days were defined by Richard's absence, her evenings and nights became her own small rebellion against the emptiness. Georgiana had been raised to be decorative and accomplished in the ways society valued. She could sketch a passable landscape, play the pianoforte adequately, and speak French with a decent accent. But her mother, in the years before her death, had also encouraged her to read widely and think deeply, gifts that had set her apart from many of her peers. In the vast library at Ravensmere Abbey, Georgiana found treasures beyond imagining. Shelf after shelf of leather-bound volumes stretched toward the coffered ceiling, collecting dust in the years since anyone had cared to read them. She discovered Shakespeare and Milton, scientific treatises and travel journals, histories of ancient Rome and contemporary accounts of the war with France. She read voraciously, carrying books to her chambers at night and reading until her candle guttered, filling the hollow spaces inside her with other people's words and worlds. It was in the library's eastern alcove that she made her most significant discovery. Her brass telescope stood on a mahogany tripod near the window, and beside it, a stack of journals bound in green leather. Curiosity drew her closer, and she opened the topmost volume to find pages covered in Richard's distinctive handwriting, filled with observations of the night sky, coordinates of stars, sketches of lunar phases, calculations she could not begin to follow. The entries dated back more than a decade, she realized, leafing through the journals with growing fascination. Here was a passion, a pursuit that had nothing to do with duty or responsibility. The handwriting in the earliest volumes was different, less controlled, younger. These had been written before whatever had transformed Richard into the remote stranger she married. She found other things too, as she explored the library more thoroughly. Pressed flowers tucked between the pages of poetry volumes, their colors faded to sepia. Drawings in charcoal, surprisingly skilled, depicting Ravensmere Abbey in different seasons. A small portrait in oils of a young woman with dark hair and laughing eyes so vivid they seemed to mock the sorrow that now filled the house, hidden behind a stack of agricultural texts as though someone could not bear to look at it, but could not bear to destroy it either. His first wife, Georgiana realized, studying the depicted face. The woman he had loved and lost, the ghost whose presence permeated this house like morning mist. She felt a profound, unlooked-for resonance with that long-dead woman, both of them bound to Richard Blackwell, both of them fundamentally alone despite the marriage bond. June arrived with warm sunshine and the blooming of Ravensmere's extensive rose gardens. Georgiana began taking morning walks through the grounds, discovering the property's beauty piece by piece. The formal gardens near the house gave way to wilder landscapes, a small lake where swans nested, woods carpeted with bluebells, meadows where tenant farmers' children played in the long grass. She encountered Richard occasionally during these walks, always by accident, never by design. He would nod courteously, exchange a few words about the weather or the gardens, and move on. But Georgiana noticed things in these brief encounters that the formality of tea time obscured. The way he stopped to examine a rose bush showing signs of disease, his fingers gentle on the affected leaves, the ease with which he greeted tenant children by name, asking after their mothers and siblings, the tiredness in his eyes some mornings, as though sleep evaded him as thoroughly as it sometimes evaded her. "My lady," Mrs. Hartley said one morning as Georgiana returned from her walk, "some of the staff have expressed concern about the condition of the servants' wing. The roof has been leaking during the recent rains, and several of the chambers have developed concerning damp." Georgiana paused in removing her bonnet, considering. This was the first time any servant had brought such a matter to her attention, the first acknowledgement that she had any authority in this house beyond choosing her daily menus. "Has Lord Ravensmere been informed?" "He is aware, my lady, but he has been focused on larger repairs to the tenant cottages. I thought perhaps you might wish to see the damage yourself. The staff would be grateful for any attention to their comfort." It was a test, Georgiana realized, but also an opportunity. She drew a steadying breath, her mind fixed on the seriousness of the neglect. "Of course," she said firmly. "Please show me." What she discovered in the servants' wing horrified her. Ceilings stained brown with water damage, plaster crumbling, bedding ruined by damp. The staff had been making do in conditions no one should be expected to endure, and from the resigned expressions she encountered, they had long since stopped expecting improvement. That afternoon, Georgiana did not go to the conservatory for tea. Instead, she presented herself at Richard's study door, knocking firmly before entering at his distracted invitation. He looked up from his desk, surprise evident on his face at this breach of their unspoken routine. "Georgiana," he said, rising automatically, "has something happened?" "Yes, my lord," she replied, pleased to hear her voice emerge steady despite her nervousness. "The servants' quarters are in an appalling state of disrepair. Mrs. Hartley showed me the damage this morning, and I must insist that immediate action be taken." His eyebrows rose slightly. "I am aware of the issue. It is on the list of repairs to be completed this autumn, after the harvest brings in additional funds. With respect, my lord, autumn is 4 months away. The staff cannot be expected to sleep in damp, unhealthy conditions for that length of time. If we can afford to maintain orchids in the conservatory, surely we can afford to repair the roof over the heads of the people who make this household function." Something shifted in Richard's expression. though Georgiana could not read what it was. He set down his pen with deliberate care. "You believe I am neglecting the welfare of my servants. I believe you have many demands on your attention and your resources," Georgiana said carefully, refusing to retreat now that she had begun. "But these people depend upon you, just as your tenants do. The responsibility you spoke of extends to those who serve within these walls as well as those who farm your lands." For a long moment, Richard simply looked at her, and Georgiana felt her courage beginning to waver under that steady grey gaze. Then, to her astonishment, his mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "You are quite right," he said quietly. "I will ride to York tomorrow to engage contractors. The repairs will begin within the week." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I should not have allowed other concerns to blind me to conditions within my own house." "Our house," Georgiana heard herself say, then immediately regretted the presumption. "I mean, I am mistress here now, even if only in name. I should like to be useful." "You are the Marchioness of Ravensmere," Richard said, his tone carrying a weight she did not fully understand. "That is far more than a name." He glanced down at the papers on his desk, then back at her. "We missed our tea this afternoon. Perhaps tomorrow we might discuss other improvements you believe necessary. Your observations appear more thorough than my own." It was an invitation, Georgiana realized with a small thrill of something that might have been hope. A small opening in the wall of formality he had built between them. "I would like that very much, my lord," she said softly. "Richard," he said abruptly, "when we are private, you need not stand on such ceremony. I am your husband, not your lord, whatever else may or may not be true between us." "Richard," Georgiana repeated, testing the name on her tongue, finding it both strange and right. "Thank you for listening." He nodded once, a gesture of dismissal that was somehow less distant than before, and Georgiana withdrew, her heart beating faster than the encounter warranted. It was a small thing, this conversation, this tiny crack in his armor, but she carried it with her like a secret treasure, turning it over in her mind as she prepared for dinner, examining it from every angle. That night, unable to sleep, Georgiana stood by her window watching the moon rise over the Yorkshire landscape. Somewhere in the house, she knew, Richard was likely in his observatory, tracking the stars with the same methodical patience he applied to everything. She thought of the journals, the pressed flowers, the hidden portrait. She thought of his hands, gentle on diseased roses and scarred from work. She thought of the key on her bedside table, untouched for 6 weeks now. What did it mean, she wondered, that he had given her freedom but surrounded her with small silent gifts? For she had noticed them, these tokens that appeared with no fanfare or explanation. A volume of Byron's poetry on the morning room table, open to a passage she had quoted during one of their tea conversations. A spray of wild roses in a simple vase by her plate at breakfast, their scent filling the room. Sheet music for a Mozart sonata she had mentioned wanting to learn, appearing on the pianoforte in the music room. Richard never mentioned these offerings, never made the claim of merit or gratitude, but Georgiana collected them in her heart like a solitary collector hoarding fine jewels, each one evidence of attention she had not known he paid. He listened, she realized. Behind that wall of formality, he listened to her scattered comments and remembered them. It was not love, perhaps, but it was something. A foundation on which something more might someday be built if she had the courage to build it. The summer deepened, and with it, the tentative connection between Georgiana and Richard. Their tea times became genuine conversations rather than exchanges of polite nothings. He asked her opinions on estate matters, and to her surprise, seemed to genuinely consider her suggestions. When she proposed establishing a small school for the tenant children, he engaged an architect to draw up plans. When she mentioned her mother's interest in medicinal herbs, he ordered the overgrown stillroom cleaned and restocked. "You have brought life back to this house," Mrs. Hartley said one morning in late July, as she and Georgiana reviewed the week's menus. "It has been too long since Ravensmere felt like a home rather than a monument." "That is kind of you to say," Georgiana replied, though the words touched a tender place inside her. She had tried so hard to make herself useful, to transform her gilded cage into something that felt like purpose. "I hope I am proving adequate to the role." "Adequate? The housekeeper's laugh was warm and genuine. "My lady, you are the finest thing to happen to this estate in a decade. His lordship is changed as well. Have you not noticed?" Georgiana had noticed. Richard smiled more readily now, though the expressions remained rare and fleeting. He sometimes joined her for breakfast, rather than retreating to his study. Once, she had encountered him in the music room late one evening, standing in the shadows as she practiced the Mozart piece, and when she stopped, startled by his presence, he had quietly asked her to continue. She had played the entire sonata with trembling fingers, acutely aware of him listening in the darkness, and when she finished, he had murmured, "Beautiful," before withdrawing like a ghost. But for all these small intimacies, the door between their chambers remained locked. The key still sat on Georgiana's bedside table, a constant reminder of the profound choice he had given her. Some nights she lay awake, wondering what would happen if she used it. Would he welcome her? Would he send her away? The uncertainty paralyzed her, and so the key remained untouched, and the door remained locked, and the question remained unasked. August brought with it the height of summer's heat and, unexpectedly, visitors. Georgiana was cutting flowers in the garden one afternoon when Mrs. Hartley hurried toward her with obvious agitation. "My lady, Lord Ravensmere's cousin has arrived from London with little notice. Sir Edmund Blackwell and his wife. They are waiting in the blue drawing room." Georgiana's stomach tightened with apprehension. Richard had mentioned his cousin only once and not favourably. Edmund stood to inherit Ravensmere if Richard died without an heir, a fact that had apparently created considerable tension between the two men. "Does Lord Ravensmere know they are here?" "He is being informed now, my lady. I thought you should be warned." Georgiana set down her basket of roses and smoothed her dress, wishing she had chosen something more formal than the simple muslin she wore for gardening. But there was nothing for it now. She made her way to the blue drawing room, where she found a couple in their mid-30s, examining the Ravensmere family portraits with expressions that suggested they were already mentally redecorating. "Lady Ravensmere," the man said, turning toward her with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "What a pleasure to finally meet my cousin's bride. I am Edmund Blackwell, and this is my wife, Lavinia." "Sir Edmund, Mrs. Blackwell," Georgiana replied, curtsying with the grace her mother had drilled into her. "Welcome to Ravensmere. I am afraid we were not expecting you, or we would have prepared more suitable accommodations." "Oh, we shan't stay long," Lavinia said, her gaze sweeping over Georgiana's simple dress with barely concealed condescension. "We were passing through on our way to Scotland and thought we should pay our respects to dear Richard and his new wife. Such a surprise when we heard of the marriage. We had entirely relinquished the hope that Richard would marry again after sweet Amelia's tragic passing." The casual use of the dead wife's name felt like a slap, clearly intended to put Georgiana in her place. Before she could formulate a response, Richard's voice came from the doorway, cold as January frost. "Edmund, I see you have made yourself at home as usual without invitation or warning." "Cousin," Edmund replied with false warmth, "can family not visit family without standing on ceremony? We wish to congratulate you on your marriage and meet your charming bride." Richard moved to stand beside Georgiana, not touching her but close enough that she could feel his presence like a shield. "Your congratulations are noted. How long do you intend to impose upon our hospitality?" "Richard, really," Lavinia said with a tinkling laugh, "you make it sound as though we are unwelcome. We simply wish to ensure that all is well here. After all, Edmund has considerable interest in the estate's welfare, given the current circumstances." The implications hung in the air like smoke, given Richard's lack of an heir, given that Edmund stood to inherit everything if Richard died childless, given that Richard's new wife showed no signs of being with child after 4 months of marriage. "All is exceedingly well," Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous softness Georgiana had never heard before. "My wife has proven herself an exceptional mistress of Ravensmere. The estate prospers under her attention, and my personal affairs are precisely that. Personal." Of course, Edmund said, though his eyes gleamed with speculation as they moved between Richard and Georgiana, noting the careful distance between them, the absence of any intimate familiarity. "We shall trouble you for 1 night only, and be on our way in the morning." The dinner that followed was an exercise in endurance. Lavinia monopolized the conversation with stories of London society, pointedly referencing people and events Georgiana knew nothing about, emphasizing her outsider status at every turn. Edmund drank heavily and made increasingly pointed comments about the need for heirs and the tragedy of great estates passing to distant branches of the family tree. Richard bore it all with icy courtesy, but Georgiana could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the muscle ticking in his jaw. When Lavinia launched into yet another reminiscence of Amelia, describing her beauty and accomplishments in exhaustive detail, Georgiana felt something inside her snap. "Your affection for the late Marchioness does you credit," she said quietly, setting down her wineglass with deliberate care. "But perhaps we might speak of pleasanter topics. Dwelling on grief serves no one." The silence that fell over the table was absolute. Lavinia's eyes widened with shock at being contradicted. Edmund smirked into his brandy, but Richard looked at Georgiana with an expression she could not decipher, something fierce and almost proud flickering in his grey eyes. "Quite right," he said firmly. "The past is past. Georgiana has brought new life to Ravensmere. That is what matters now." After dinner, Georgiana escaped to the music room under the pretext of practicing, desperate for solitude after the strain of the evening. She had been playing for perhaps 20 minutes when she sensed rather than heard Richard enter the room. Her fingers stumbled on the keys and she stopped, turning to find him standing just inside the doorway. "I apologize," he said quietly. "For Edmund and Lavinia, they have always been grasping and cruel. I should have warned you." "You could not have known they would arrive unannounced," Georgiana replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. "I am only sorry if I spoke out of turn. I had no right to silence her reminiscences of your late wife." Richard crossed the room to stand beside the pianoforte, his expression difficult to read in the candlelight. "You had every right," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made her breath catch. "You are the Marchioness of Ravensmere. This is your home, and I will not have you subjected to such calculated cruelty under my own roof." "She loved you," Georgiana said softly, the words escaping before she could call them back. "Your first wife. I have seen her portrait. She was beautiful." "She was," Richard agreed, and something in his tone made Georgiana's chest ache. "She was also kind and gentle and far too young when I married her, and I killed her through my selfishness and pride." The raw pain in his voice shocked Georgiana into stillness. "Richard, no. You cannot believe that." "Can I not?" He turned away, his hands gripping the edge of a nearby table until his knuckles whitened. "I married Amelia when she was 17 and I was 33. She was the daughter of a neighboring estate, sweet and biddable, and everything society said a wife should be. We married, and within a year she was with child. She was terrified of childbirth, begged me not to, but I wanted an heir. I insisted, and she died in agony, screaming for hours, and took our son with her." Georgiana rose from the piano bench, her heart breaking for him, for the guilt that had clearly consumed him for 8 years. "That was not your fault. Childbirth is dangerous. Women die. It is a tragedy, but not a crime." "I knew her fear," Richard said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "I knew she did not want to risk it, but I had my duty, my precious legacy to protect. So I got her with child, and I killed her for it. Do you understand now why I gave you that key? Why I will never force any woman to that risk again?" Understanding crashed over Georgiana like a wave. The locked door, the scrupulous distance, the careful courtesy. It was not indifference. It was penance. Richard had been punishing himself for 8 years, denying himself any warmth or intimacy, convinced that his desire had murdered the woman he loved. "So you would deny yourself any happiness for the rest of your life," she said quietly. "You would condemn us both to loneliness as payment for a tragedy you did not cause." "I would not risk your life for my comfort," Richard said fiercely, finally meeting her eyes. "I married you to save you from destitution, to give you security and safety, not to sentence you to the same fate as Amelia. And what if I choose differently?" The words emerged before Georgiana fully understood what she was saying, but once spoken she could not call them back. "What if I want more than security? What if I want a marriage, not a business arrangement?" Richard stared at her as though she had spoken in a foreign language. "You do not know what you are saying." "Do I not?" Georgiana moved closer, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "I have lived in this house for 4 months, Richard. I have watched you care for your tenants and your servants with diligence and compassion. I have read your astronomical journals and seen your drawings. I have received your silent gifts and noticed your attention. You are not the cold, unfeeling man you pretend to be. You are terrified, and you have let that fear build a prison for both of us." "Better a prison than a grave," he said harshly. "Is it?" Georgiana challenged. "You gave me freedom, Richard. You gave me choice. But what about your freedom, your choice? You have sentenced yourself to a half-life out of guilt, and you expect me to accept the same sentence out of, what, gratitude? Obligation? I expect you to accept the safety I can provide," Richard said, his voice dropping. "I expect you to live a long and healthy life, unendangered by my desire or my weakness." "Then you condemn us both," Georgiana whispered, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "Because safety without love is just another form of dying, Richard. I know. I've been dying by inches since the day my uncle sold me to pay my father's debts. But you gave me hope when you gave me that key. You showed me that captivity could be transformed into sanctuary. Do not take that away now because you are afraid." They stood in the candlelit music room, barely 2 feet apart, and Georgiana could see the war raging behind Richard's eyes. Want and fear, hope and guilt, all battling for supremacy in a man who had spent 8 years in self-imposed exile from everything that made life worth living. "I cannot bear to lose another wife," he said finally, his voice breaking on the words. "I cannot survive that pain again." "Then do not lose me," Georgiana replied, reaching out to touch his hand where it still gripped the table edge. "Let me stay. Let me be your wife in truth, not just in name. Let us build something together, something more than this beautiful, lonely sanctuary we have created." Richard looked down at her hand on his, small and pale against his sun-darkened skin, and for a long moment he did not move. Then, slowly, carefully, as though she might shatter at too sudden a movement, he turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. "I do not deserve you," he said quietly. "You should have married someone young and whole, someone who could give you joy instead of this broken thing I have become." "I did not marry someone young and whole," Georgiana said, her thumb stroking across his knuckles. "I married you, and I find I would not have it otherwise even if I could." She did not know who moved first. Perhaps they moved together, drawn by the same desperate need for connection, for warmth, for the end of loneliness. But suddenly she was in his arms, and his mouth was on hers, and the kiss was nothing like the chaste brush of lips at their wedding ceremony. This was heat and hunger, and 8 years of self-denial breaking like a dam, and Georgiana met it with her own need, her own fierce refusal to accept the half-life he had tried to give them both. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Richard rested his forehead against hers, his hands trembling where they cupped her face. "I am afraid," he whispered. "I am so desperately afraid of failing you the way I failed Amelia." "Then we will be afraid together," Georgiana whispered back. "But we will not let fear rule us. We will not let it steal what we might have." That night, for the first time since her wedding, Georgiana did not sleep alone. She carried the silver key from her bedside table to the connecting door and unlocked it with trembling hands, pushing it open to find Richard waiting in his own chamber, still dressed, clearly unable to sleep after the intensity of their encounter in the music room. "I choose this," she said, standing in the doorway between their worlds. "I choose you. I choose us. Not out of duty or obligation, but because I want to. Because I have come to care for you more than I understood until tonight. Will you accept my choice, Richard? Will you let me stay?" He crossed the room in 3 strides and caught her in his arms again, and this time when he kissed her, it was not desperate or fierce, but tender, reverent, full of wonder that she was real, and here, and choosing him despite everything. They made love slowly, carefully, Richard constantly checking her comfort and consent, and Georgiana learned that intimacy could be gentle and generous, and nothing like the clinical duty she had been taught to expect. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, she felt his hand stroke her hair and heard him murmur words she almost did not catch. "Thank you for not giving up on me, for seeing past the walls I built. Thank you," she whispered back, "for giving me freedom. It made choosing you so much sweeter." Edmund and Lavinia departed the next morning, their departure hastened by the unmistakable change in the air between Richard and Georgiana. The couple appeared at breakfast together, and even Lavinia's sharp eyes could not miss the new intimacy in the way Richard held Georgiana's chair, the way their hands brushed when he passed her the marmalade, the soft expression that had replaced his customary reserve. "How lovely," Lavinia said with a smile that had teeth behind it. "Newlyweds in bloom. One can only hope this newfound warmth bears the fruit Ravensmere requires." "One can only hope you have a safe journey to Scotland," Richard replied coolly. "The roads can be treacherous this time of year. Do take care." After they had gone, Richard found Georgiana in the rose garden and pulled her into his arms right there among the blooms, scandalizing a passing gardener. "I should have sent them away immediately," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I am sorry you had to endure their venom." "They showed me something important," Georgiana replied, leaning into his embrace. "They showed me what you are not. You are not grasping or cruel or calculating. You are wounded and kind and trying so hard to do right that you nearly destroyed yourself in the process. I am glad I know that now." The months that followed were a revelation. Richard was not a demonstrative man by nature, but he showed his growing love for Georgiana in 1,000 small ways. He taught her to use his telescope, standing behind her to adjust the focus, his breath warm against her ear as he explained the constellations. He commissioned a portrait of her to hang beside his own in the gallery, insisting the artist depict her in the blue dress she wore the day she confronted him about the servants' quarters, the first time she had truly been the mistress of Ravensmere rather than a decorative guest. They rode together across the estate and Richard showed her the land as he knew it, pointing out improvements and problems, asking her opinions and genuinely considering her suggestions. When she proposed improvements to the still-developing school for tenant children, he provided the funds without hesitation. When she wanted to expand the medicinal garden, he personally helped her lay out the beds. Their evenings were spent together now, sometimes in the library reading companionably, sometimes in the music room where Richard would listen to her play, sometimes simply in the drawing room talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his childhood, about his parents, about the weight of inheritance and the loneliness of being the only child of elderly parents who died within a year of each other. She told him about her mother's death, about the slow degradation of watching her father gamble away everything her family had built, about the humiliation of becoming a burden to an uncle who saw her only as an inconvenient obligation. "We are both survivors of sorts," Richard said one night as they lay together in the bed they now shared. "Haunted by what we have lost, trying to build something from the rubble." "Then let us build well," Georgiana replied, her hand over his heart, feeling its steady beat. "Let us build something worthy of what we have survived." But their happiness was not without shadows. As autumn arrived and Georgiana did not quicken with child, she noticed Richard's increasing tension, the way his hand sometimes went to her stomach with a mixture of hope and fear. They did not speak of it directly, but the unspoken question hung between them. What if she did become pregnant? Would Richard's terror return? Would the spectre of Amelia rise between them again? The answer came in late October, when Georgiana woke one morning feeling queasy and found herself unable to keep down her breakfast. Mrs. Hartley took one look at her pale face and called for the doctor from the village, who confirmed what Georgiana had already begun to suspect. She was with child. She should have been joyful. Instead, she felt only dread, knowing what this news would do to Richard. She found him in his study that afternoon and closed the door behind her, her hands clasped tightly to stop their shaking. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. He looked up from his correspondence and she saw his expression change as he registered her pallor. "What is wrong? Are you ill?" "I am with child," Georgiana said, the words falling between them like stones into still water. Richard went absolutely white. He stood slowly, mechanically, like a man moving underwater. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no. I promised myself. I swore I would never." "Richard," Georgiana began, but he was already moving toward the door, away from her, his breathing harsh and panicked. A chilling memory of screams overwhelmed his senses. "I cannot do this," he said, his voice breaking. "I cannot watch it happen again. I cannot sit by while you scream and bleed and die because I was selfish enough to want you, because I could not control myself, because I am weak and contemptible, and I have killed you just as surely as I killed Amelia." "I am not dead," Georgiana said firmly, though tears were streaming down her face. "I am here, Richard. I am alive, and I am strong, and I am not Amelia." But he was already gone, the door slamming behind him, and Georgiana sank into his desk chair with her head in her hands, sobbing with fear and frustration and love for a man so traumatized by loss that he could not accept the gift of new life. For 3 days, Richard avoided her completely. He slept in his study, took his meals there, and when she tried to force the issue, he simply left the room. The servants whispered, confused by the sudden return to the coldness that had defined the early months of the marriage. Mrs. Hartley tried to offer comfort, but what comfort could there be when the man Georgiana loved was so terrified of losing her that he could not bear to be in the same room? On the 4th day, Georgiana had had enough. She marched into his study without knocking, locked the door behind her, and stood between Richard and his only escape route. "You will listen to me," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "You will sit down and you will listen to every word I have to say, because I am your wife, and I am carrying your child, and I deserve to be heard." Richard stood behind his desk like a man facing execution, but he did not try to push past her. That at least was something. "I am not Amelia," Georgiana said, her hands resting on her still flat stomach. "I am not 17 and terrified. I am 20 years old and I am strong, and I chose this, Richard. I chose you, knowing the risk, knowing the possibilities. You gave me freedom, remember? You gave me choice. Well, I am choosing to have this baby. I am choosing to take whatever risk comes with it. And you do not get to take that choice away from me by wallowing in guilt and fear." "You do not understand," Richard said hoarsely. "You have not seen what I have seen. You have not heard what I heard." Amelia screamed for hours, Georgiana. She begged me to make it stop, and there was nothing I could do. Nothing. I held her hand while she died, and her last words were my name, said with such accusation, such betrayal. I cannot go through that again. I cannot watch you suffer and know that I caused it. "Then do not watch me die," Georgiana said fiercely. "Watch me live. Watch me grow round with this child. Watch me bring new life into this house that has known too much death. But do it beside me, Richard, not locked away in here drowning in ghosts and what-ifs. What if I lose you?" The question was barely a whisper, but it held all the terror of 8 years of grief and guilt. "What if you do not?" Georgiana countered. "What if I survive, Richard? What if I give you a healthy child and live to grow old with you? What if all your fear is for nothing, and you waste these months that we could spend together preparing for our baby, building our family, being happy?" "I do not know how to be happy when I am so afraid," Richard confessed, and Georgiana heard the truth in it, the raw honesty of a man who had forgotten what joy felt like. She crossed to him and took his face between her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Then let me teach you," she said softly. "Let me show you that life is stronger than fear, that love is worth the risk, that we are worth fighting for. Let me be afraid with you, Richard, but let us be afraid together. Do not shut me out, not now, not when I need you most." For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and she could see the battle raging inside him, terror and love locked in mortal combat. Then slowly his hands came up to cover hers where they rested against his face, and he leaned into her touch like a man finding water in the desert. "I am so afraid," he whispered again, but this time it was confession, not flight. "I know," Georgiana whispered back. "So am I. But we will be afraid together, and we will get through this together, and we will meet our child together. I promise you, Richard. I promise." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. and she felt wetness against her neck and realized he was weeping, 8 years of suppressed grief and terror finally breaking free. She held him while he shook with it, stroking his hair, murmuring reassurances, being the strong one because he had been strong for so long. When the storm passed, Richard pulled back enough to look at her, his eyes red-rimmed but clearer than she had seen them in days. "I love you," he said hoarsely. "I should have said it before. I should have told you every day. I love you, Georgiana. You are the finest thing that has ever happened to me, and the thought of losing you unmans me completely." "You will not lose me," Georgiana said firmly. "I am made of stronger stuff than you give me credit for. And I love you too, Richard. I think I have loved you since the day you gave me that key and trusted me to choose my own path. Now choose to walk that path with me. Choose to trust that we will come through this." "I will try," he said, and it was enough. It had to be enough. The months of Georgiana's pregnancy were not easy. Richard's fear did not simply vanish because he willed it so, and there were dark days when the old terror returned, when he could not bear to touch her swelling belly or talk about the coming child. But he did not run. He stayed, and he fought his demons, and gradually, with Georgiana's patient love and determination, he began to hope. He engaged the finest doctors in England, despite Georgiana's protests about the expense. He read every medical text he could find on childbirth and maternal health. He hovered with consuming anxiety, worrying over every twinge and discomfort, driving Georgiana to distraction with his concern. But she bore it with grace, understanding the fear that drove it, knowing that action was how Richard managed anxiety. Spring came early to Yorkshire, and with it, Georgiana's time approached. Richard had transformed a suite of rooms on the ground floor into what he called the birthing chambers, complete with the most modern medical equipment and a team of specialists who would attend the birth. It was excessive and probably unnecessary, but Georgiana allowed it, knowing he needed to feel he was doing something, anything, to keep her safe. When her pains began on a warm April morning, almost exactly a year after their marriage, Richard's face drained of color, his grip tightening on her hand until his knuckles whitened, but he held her hand and helped her to the prepared chambers. The doctors arrived, the midwife took charge, and Richard was firmly but politely told that his presence was not required for the actual birth. "I am staying," he said flatly. "I will not leave her." The head physician looked scandalous at the suggestion, but Georgiana tightened her grip on Richard's hand. "He stays," she said firmly between contractions. "He is my husband. He stays." And so Richard remained, holding her hand through the long hours of labor, whispering encouragement and apologies in equal measure, his face gray with terror, but his presence unwavering. When their daughter finally emerged into the world with a lusty cry, he wept openly, his hands trembling as the midwife placed the tiny wailing bundle in his arms. "A girl," the midwife announced with satisfaction. "Healthy lungs, strong heartbeat. Well done, my lady." "Georgiana," Richard said, his voice shaking as he looked from the baby to his wife. "Are you well? Are you in pain? Do you need anything?" "I need you to stop looking like you expect me to expire at any moment," Georgiana said with exhausted amusement, "and come here so I can see our daughter properly." He carried the baby to her bedside, settling into the chair beside her, and together they examined the miracle they had made. She had Richard's dark hair and Georgiana's nose, and when she opened her eyes they were the grey of storm clouds, just like her father's. "What shall we name her?" Richard asked softly, his finger stroking the baby's impossibly small hand. "Amelia," Georgiana said firmly, and when Richard's eyes shot to hers in shock, she smiled. "I choose to honor her memory, Richard, not as a symbol of your guilt, but as a bridge between your past and our future. Let your daughter carry her name and let it stand for life, not tragedy." "Amelia Grace," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion, "for both the women who have saved me from myself." In the days that followed, Richard was transformed. The fear did not disappear entirely, but it was tempered now by joy by the reality of Georgiana's survival and the perfect health of their daughter. He was a devoted father, spending hours simply watching Amelia sleep, marveling at every tiny movement and sound. And with Georgiana, he was tender and attentive, helping her through her recovery, with the same meticulous care he had shown in preparing for the birth. "You were right," he told her one evening, as they sat together in the nursery, watching their daughter sleep in her cradle, "about fear and love and choosing life over safety. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand." "You understood when it mattered," Georgiana replied, leaning against his shoulder. "You stayed, Richard. When you wanted to run, when every instinct told you to protect yourself, you stayed. That is what counts." 4 years later, Ravensmere Abbey had been transformed from a monument to grief into a true home. Amelia, now a precocious child of 3, had a younger brother, Thomas, born with far less drama and fear than his sister. The estate prospered under Richard and Georgiana's combined stewardship. The tenant school was the finest in the county, and the medicinal gardens supplied half of Yorkshire with remedies. Edmund and Lavinia had made one more visit, ostensibly to meet the children, but really to assess their diminished prospects of inheriting. They found Ravensmere filled with life and laughter, Richard smiling freely, Georgiana radiant with health and happiness. They left after 2 uncomfortable days and did not return. On a warm summer evening, Richard approached Georgiana in the rose garden, where he had first kissed her all those years ago. She was cutting flowers for the dinner table, humming softly to herself, and he paused just to watch her, marveling as he still did at the gift of her presence in his life. "What are you thinking?" she asked without turning, somehow always knowing when he was near. "I am thinking," Richard said, coming to her side, "that you gave me freedom when you used that key. Freedom from guilt, from fear, from the prison I had built for myself. I am thinking that I do not tell you often enough how grateful I am, how completely you have transformed my life." Georgiana set down her basket and turned to face him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. "You gave me freedom first," she reminded him gently. "You trusted me to choose my own path. That is the gift that made everything else possible. Then we freed each other," Richard said, pulling her close, breathing in the scent of roses and sunshine that always clung to her. "What an extraordinary thing, to find someone who sees your chains and helps you break them rather than adding their own." "What an extraordinary thing," Georgiana agreed, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. "To find love in the last place you expected it, and discover it was exactly where you needed to be all along." The key that had unlocked the door between their chambers had unlocked something far more important. 2 hearts that had learned, slowly and painfully but truly, that sometimes the greatest act of love is trusting someone else to choose their own fate. And the greatest gift is when they choose you. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this journey. If this story of freedom, fear, and the courage to love, despite both, touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of redemption, resilience, and love that transforms everything it touches.